Hello, and welcome to this webcast on perspectives on researching and practicing anti-nuclear activism, how academics and activists think about disarmament. My name is Charles Krause, and I'm the Deputy Director of the History and Public Policy Program at the Wilson Center. For those of you not familiar with our institution, the Wilson Center is the congressionally chartered living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We are a strictly nonpartisan, scholarship-driven research institution focused on global affairs. Within the Wilson Center, the History and Public Policy program uses history as a tool for foreign policy analysis. We make public the primary source record of 20th and 21st century international history through an award-winning digital archive and facilitate historically grounded scholarship and conversations on recent international history, such as this one today. So I am pleased to welcome historians Luc-Andre Brunet and Anna-Mart Van Wyck for this conversation, as well as Alicia Sanders Zakre of the Nobel Peace Prize winning NGO known as ICAN, or the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Our panelists will discuss how academics and activists approach the topics of disarmament and anti-nuclear activism. They will also explore the opportunities and challenges around academics and NGOs working together, showcasing recent collaborations on the history of anti-nuclear activism, ranging from academic outputs to public education. After all three speakers have had their turn, we will have the opportunity to take questions from our live audience. Please use the online form labeled Event Chat immediately below the webcast to submit a question. I also hope for some discussion amongst the panelists, so please do feel free to ask questions of each other. Before handing things off to our speakers, I do want to acknowledge the behind-the-scenes efforts of my colleagues in the History and Public Policy program. That's Peter Bierstecker, Christian Osterman, and Keon Byrne, as well as in the Wilson Center's Audiovisual Department, Keen McBride, and thank them for making this session possible. So our first speaker today is Luc-Andre Brunet, who is a senior lecturer in contemporary international history at the Open University in the United Kingdom, as well as co-director of the Peace and Security Project at LSE Ideas. His research focuses on the dynamics between peace and anti-nuclear activism, as well as on policymaking and diplomacy. He is the principal investigator of the AHRC-funded project, Global Histories of Peace and Nuclear Activism, and he is currently completing a book on Canada, the global nuclear order, and the end of the Cold War. I will introduce our other speakers immediately ahead of their turns. So Luc, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks especially to the team at the Wilson Center for organizing today's event. It's always a pleasure to participate in Wilson Center events. I'd like to approach the question of how academics and activists can collaborate by looking at the example of a two-year research project that's now coming to a close, which I've had the pleasure of co-directing with Irina Karamuzzi. So I thought I'd start by giving a quick overview of the project and discussing how we've worked as academics, how we've worked with activists. And then I'll say a bit more about two specific examples of work that we've done together as part of this project. So in 2022, we started a project funded by the British Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC, called, as Chuck noted a moment ago, Global Histories of Peace and Anti-Nuclear Activism. Now, there's been a lot of excellent and exciting research over the last decade or so on anti-nuclear activism during the Cold War, and especially looking at the so-called Euro missile crisis of the 1980s. So essentially public opposition to the planned deployment of American nuclear missiles in Western Europe, in NATO allies. So understandably, the focus of much of this scholarship has been on the United States and on Western Europe, really on the key members of the Atlantic Alliance, of NATO. And what we wanted to do with this project is really to broaden the scope of these studies by looking at anti-nuclear activism in other parts of the world and seeing how these combined distinct local factors with broader transnational and global efforts against nuclear weapons. So for the project, we put together a network of 9 partner institutions across 5 continents. So as you can see here, in the UK, we have the Open University, the University of Sheffield, and LSE Ideas. We have the Wilson Centre, of course, and ICAN, and the University of Johannesburg, which are represented by our other panelists today, as well as Stockholm University, the Federal University of Goiás in Brazil, and the Hiroshima Peace Institute at Hiroshima City University. And it's been such a stimulating and rewarding experience to work with these colleagues over the last 2 years on this project. So in setting this up, in addition to academics working in and working on different parts of the world, we really wanted to bring together academics and activists working on these issues. And so given the global scope of the project, ICAN was really the ideal partner for this. So their campaign to abolish nuclear weapons worldwide relies on high-level activities, on the one hand, working with national governments and at the UN, as well as with local partners in well over 100 countries. So ICAN's mission and approach, which combines these global and local dimensions, really meant it was at the very top of our list of possible partners for the project. So prior to the event that we're holding here today at the Wilson Centre, we've organized 4 workshops as part of this project. So these were hosted by Stockholm University, the University of Johannesburg, the Federal University of Goiás, and Hiroshima Peace Institute. And at each of these workshops, we've worked with local partners to bring together activists and academics to have a genuine dialogue. And one thing that really struck me was how far this practice of bringing these different groups of people together has really varied from country to country. So our first workshop was in Sweden, where really for decades, the Swedish government has worked with activists, with NGOs, with civil society organizations, precisely on the cause of nuclear disarmament. So there are well-established fora, and this exchange was considered quite normal by all involved in that workshop. By contrast, in both South Africa and Brazil, participants noted that this was really the first time that academics and activists in the country were brought together to discuss these issues. And so it was genuinely exciting being a part of these new exchanges. And I think Anna-Mart will say a bit more, in particular, on the South African workshop on this panel. And I think this project also shows some of the opportunities that can arise from academics and activists working together. As an historian working on nuclear issues, my own understanding has been enriched immeasurably by these dialogues with activists in different parts of the world. And I certainly hope that this has led us to writing better histories of anti-nuclear activism, having incorporated these different voices and perspectives, and sometimes even new sources provided by some of the activists at these workshops. On the other hand, I certainly hope it's been a positive collaboration for the activists involved as well. I'll leave it to Alicia to respond on that point and perhaps disabuse me of any misapprehensions. I suppose my nagging worry throughout this project has been that there might be a tension between, say, academic integrity on the one hand and working with activists who are campaigning for specific goals and seeking specific policy changes. So I could imagine scenarios in which I might be pressured to adapt my academic findings to better fit a campaign being led by activists on the one hand, or I suppose on the other hand, that I might annoy our NGO partners if my academic research challenged with or didn't quite fit with some of their own campaigns or actions or arguments. In practice, however, neither of these issues really arose. Part of this was, I'm sure, thanks to working with a partner like ICAN, whose work has always been rooted in rigorous and well-supported research, and which also invites quite a wide range of viewpoints on nuclear issues. But equally, I found the experience of working with local activists and NGOs in different parts of the world to be a very constructive experience. So this is something we can perhaps come back to in the discussion. I'd be interested to hear Anna-Mart's and Alicia's thoughts on this. But certainly from my perspective, I don't think we ruffled too many feathers at any stage in collaborating on this project. So now, in the time I have left, I'd like to highlight 2 outputs that have arisen from this project. and which I think demonstrate this fruitful interaction and cooperation between academics and activists. So first, we have a forthcoming volume edited by Irina Karamuzzi and myself, bringing together diverse histories of anti-nuclear activism, particularly, but not exclusively, during the late Cold War. So across the chapters, we look at anti-nuclear activism in, I think, 15 different countries, covering every continent. And we're delighted to co-author the concluding piece of the edited volume with Alicia from ICAN. And so I thought I'd highlight just a few of the broad conclusions from the volume. So I think, first of all, one crucial finding is really the importance of very local issues to mobilize individuals against nuclear weapons. So although nuclear disarmament or fears of nuclear war are global issues, these are manifested in very specific contexts in many different ways. So in many cases, opposition to nuclear weapons is closely linked with other issues. Could be national sovereignty or anti-imperialism, in some cases anti-Americanism, and so on. And so we need to understand the local specificities in order to understand how anti-nuclear activism flourished, or indeed why it failed to flourish in different parts of the world. Second, I suppose another insight from looking at a much broader range of countries is that the familiar chronology around anti-nuclear activism and its close link with the end of the Cold War often makes less sense when we move away from the North Atlantic. So nuclear disarmament in Brazil and Argentina in the 1980s, for example, was closely tied to the democratization process in those two countries. Similarly, Anna-Mart can speak on this with much more expertise than I can, but South Africa's decision to give up nuclear weapons in the early 1990s was largely about the end of apartheid and the transition to democracy. And so in these cases, the Cold War and superpower relations were decidedly secondary factors. In the North Atlantic context, the years 1987 and 1989 loom especially large. So in 1987, we have the INF Treaty signed by Reagan and Gorbachev, which effectively resulted in the removal of all the Euro missiles, all the intermediate range nuclear missiles from Europe. And this in turn paved the way for the end of the Cold War in 1989 or thereabouts. But these dates and these events had relatively little impact in other parts of the world regarding nuclear weapons. So in East Asia, for example, Cold War era divisions remained, perhaps most notably on the Korean Peninsula. In India, for its part, anti-nuclear activism and activism against nuclear weapons really only developed as a mass movement much later in the 1990s, so well after the end of the Cold War. So I think the more Eurocentric or North Atlantic-centric understanding of anti-nuclear activism being linked to the Cold War tensions of the 1980s can't simply be applied to other parts of the world where other dynamics were very much at work. And then the last conclusion I thought I'd highlight here from the edited volume is the importance of reconsidering who should be considered as an activist. I think in the United States and Western Europe, in the 1980s, there was generally a very antagonistic relationship between governments led by figures such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and anti-nuclear activists, organizations like the Freeze campaign in the US, the CND in the UK. But in many other parts of the world, there's been a much more constructive relationship between activists and governments, which has led to successful initiatives such as, perhaps most notably, nuclear weapons-free zones, which currently cover the majority of the Southern Hemisphere. And even in some European countries, it may be more appropriate to describe leaders such as Olof Palme of Sweden or Andreas Papandreou of Greece as both activists and policymakers themselves. So I think this challenges perhaps the prevailing more binary understanding of activists in opposition to governments with little crossover between the two. So in addition to these broader conclusions, I think the individual chapters of the volume provide excellent studies of anti-nuclear activism in individual countries, many of which have been largely overlooked in the existing literature. So the book is due to be published in April 2025, so we'll still need to wait a little while longer before we can read it. But we're delighted that it will be published open access, meaning it can be read for free from anywhere in the world, rather than having to pay the sometimes eye-watering prices associated with academic books. And now, the second output I'd like to highlight today is a brand new resource that we've just launched this week, actually. And so it's a free online course on the history of anti-nuclear activism since 1945. So it's called Banning the Bomb, A Global History of Activism Against Nuclear Weapons. And it's produced by the Open University in the UK on a platform called OpenLearn. So it takes about 6 hours to complete, and it's free to access from anywhere in the world. And you even get a certificate at the end of it when you complete it. So there's a link, or there should be a link on the slide, but I'll pop it into the chat as well for those of you who are interested in having a look. And I think even more than the edited volume, this work was really shaped with our work with activists over the last 2 years. The structure and the themes of the course were informed by our discussions at the workshops we organized over the course of the project. So here's an overview of the course. So at the start of the course, we look at why people have opposed nuclear weapons, looking at things like the scale of destruction they bring, the impact of nuclear weapons testing, as well as the financial costs of these weapons. Then we look at how people in different parts of the world have mobilized against nuclear weapons. And we have examples ranging from the UK to Polynesia to explore these different forms of activism. We then have a third session specifically on transnational cooperation among activists, looking at how individuals have collaborated across national borders to oppose nuclear weapons. And then from there, we explore how different governments have responded to anti-nuclear activism. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that the US and the UK governments and activists often had a much more adversarial relationship. But we look at examples from regimes where protest simply wasn't tolerated and was in practice quashed, such as South Africa under apartheid and the Soviet Union, as well as examples of governments engaging much more constructively with activists. And then this leads to the next session, which looks at what anti-nuclear activism has achieved in different parts of the world. I suppose one of the recurring questions that's debated amongst historians is whether this anti-nuclear protest has brought about meaningful change and changes in policy. And so while we don't claim to have the last word on this, on the course, we certainly do consider the role of activism in developments like nuclear weapons-free zones and indeed the INF Treaty. And then finally, the last session of the course looks at a recent, indeed an ongoing issue for activists, namely the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So on the course, we were able to include newly recorded interviews, testimonials, and photos provided to us by activists from South Africa, Japan, the UK, and elsewhere. And we were especially keen to include the voices of those who've been directly impacted by nuclear weapons, including hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as those who've been affected by nuclear testing in different parts of the world. And this course has been co-created with ICAN. So the shape and the scope of the course were developed through discussions with the team, and particularly with Alicia. And we benefited tremendously from their input throughout, from having them comment on draft course material to having them produce new video content, which we've been able to use on the course. And we think that the course really strikes the right balance in that it has the academic rigor and objectivity that we'd expect from academic research, while being relevant and readily applicable to activists and members of the public who want to learn more about the issue. So I'd encourage you all to have a look at the course. I think this is the link on the bottom of this slide, but I'll share that in the chat in a moment. So please do share it with anyone who might be interested, and feel free to check out the course yourself. Now, I'm sure I'm out of time, but I thought I'd very briefly conclude by mentioning one ongoing initiative that we're working on to wrap up the project, particularly with the Wilson Center that involves working with activists. So with just a few exceptions, the archives of anti-nuclear organizations, as well as NGOs and individual activists, are not only underused by historians, but they often aren't properly collected and available to researchers. So aside from being frustrating for individual historians working on this, the bigger problem here is that it risks distorting the kind of histories that we write. So we think it's essential to recover these voices and make this part of the narrative. And with that objective in mind, we're building a digital peace archive to identify, digitize, and share these resources. By bringing together and making available these new sources, we hope to encourage further new directions for historical research on anti-nuclear activism. And we're working with the team here at the Wilson Center to integrate these sources into their existing digital archive that Chuck mentioned in his opening remarks. And so that way, when researchers or students, teachers, activists, members of the public search the digital archive for, say, nuclear and Brazil, they'll get not only documents pertaining to high-level governmental decisions or diplomatic cables, but also material pertaining to anti-nuclear activism in that country. So I've just a few examples on the screen here, ranging from leaflets to sort of posters advertising events, correspondence and internal documents. And we also have some great photos that have been contributed by activists as well. So I'll conclude with an invitation to the activists and the researchers in the audience. If you have any material that you might like to contribute, or if you'd like to learn more about it, please do get in touch. And I think I'll hand back over to Chuck and to our next speakers. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Luc. So yeah, now we will hear from Anna-Mart van Wyk, who is a historian and professor of international relations at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. She is a leading specialist on South Africa's nuclear history, and her multinational archival research has been published in numerous international publications. She is a former Wilson Center public policy scholar and a longtime collaborator in many of our international research efforts. If I can piggyback off of something Luc just said about the Wilson Center Digital Archive and contributing to it, Anna-Mart is a shining example of this. She has contributed countless archival documents from hard-to-access archives in South Africa about South African nuclear history and made them freely accessible through the Wilson Center Digital Archive. So countless scholars and students are in Anna-Mart's debt, and so I would like to just thank her for that in this public forum. So Anna-Mart, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chuck. And yeah, you can stop now. Thank you. But yes, it's a pleasure to be involved in another Wilson Center event. And Luc, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen, although I will talk a bit first about the workshop that I hosted in April of 2023. But let me quickly start my slideshow. Hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so yeah, just to quickly add on to what these two things that Luc just mentioned. So when he reached out to me to have one of the 4 workshops that he referred to be hosted at the University of Johannesburg, I had this question, okay, so where do I start? Because in South Africa, there really isn't any history of academics and activists really coming together in one room and discussing issues of anti-nuclear activism. So that was the first dilemma that I faced. Then he also mentioned who constitutes an activist, and that was my second dilemma, because with South Africa's liberation history, a lot of the anti-nuclear activism that took place during that time could not be divorced, of course, from the liberation struggle that was ongoing at the time. So when I started thinking about how to put this together, my plan was to include academics, as well as former and current actors from local and international NGOs, and also South African and African policymakers in an interactive discussion setting. My plan was for the first part of the workshop to really focus on the role of the African National Congress, or the ANC, and or the international movement against apartheid, and or other activist groups in South African government's decision to end its nuclear weapons program. The end of the nuclear weapons program was such a monumental moment in nuclear history that we really could not neglect it, you know, in any conference that we talk about anti-nuclear activism in South Africa. And from all four of the participating institutions in this project, South Africa really was the only example of a state that had a nuclear weapons program and had given up that program. So that was an important aspect for me that we needed to include in the workshop. Now, whenever we talked about the anti-apartheid movement and the liberation struggle, of course, it was intertwined with activism against the nuclear weapons program. So I very much wanted to include relevant role players that could speak to this. And two major activities stood out in this regard. The first one was the bombing of the newly built Koeberg nuclear power station in 1982, which was the first act of nuclear terrorism on the African continent, and as far as I know, actually the only one. It formed part of the ANC's military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe's strategy of bombing national strategic key points of the apartheid government. And then secondly, I wanted to highlight the international efforts of Ambassador Abdul Samad Minty, who headed up the world campaign against military and nuclear collaboration with South Africa. And I've also, the chapter that I've contributed to the book that Luc told us is coming out in April of next year, I contributed the chapter on Ambassador Minty, because his efforts since the early 1960s and then from 1978 as a director of the World Campaign was nothing short of really amazing. So that was what I wanted to start off with. And the plan was really to try and find the people actually responsible for the bombing of Koeberg, you know, to really start the conference off with that as kind of like a major focus of where anti-nuclear activism in South Africa really came to a highlight at that point in terms of the nuclear weapons program. Of course, there were also other groups that were against the building of Koeberg from the start, the Koeberg nuclear power station. So one of the civil society groups that I wanted to get involved was called Koeberg Alert, which later became the Koeberg Alert Alliance. So from the start for me, it was about having the focus on these two aspects. On the one side, what was the activism against the nuclear weapons program? And on the other side, also overall anti-nuclear activism in South Africa that extended beyond the nuclear weapons program. And also post-1994, where South Africa finally became a state of inclusive democracy, basically the new South Africa, and now the ANC moving from being a liberation movement to being the government of South Africa. How would they take South Africa's nuclear policies forward? Now, recruiting participants for this conference was really a team effort, and I would really want to acknowledge the efforts of my colleagues, Professors Joansi van Wyk and Julien Pretorius, as well as Noel Stott of Vertic, who have all done amazing work on South Africa's nuclear journey. And Julien Pretorius in particular is very active in PACWASH and ICAN. And so that for me was the third aspect of the conference that I really wanted to put the spotlight on in terms of a perspective on Africa's role within these entities. So the collegial deliberations between all of us academics finally resulted in an initial list of potential participants. And from there on, a classical methodological snowballing took place. We acted on further references and suggestions. It was really a case of someone knew someone who knew someone, and would send us the contact details so that we can start sending out invitations. And I must say the civil society activists in South Africa was really, really great in providing further contacts. It all started with contacting the Koeberg Alert Alliance. And this is really a group of organizations and individuals concerned about nuclear reactors at the Koeberg nuclear power station, which is about 28 kilometers from Cape Town. And they are also still opposed. They're very much still active, and they're opposed to the building of further nuclear reactors at Koeberg, but by extension also against the plans of the ANC to expand civil nuclear energy in South Africa even further and build more nuclear power stations. So subsequently, with the help also then of Kubek Alert, we reached out to Earth Life Africa, the Southern African faith communities, and the Green Connection. So of course, the rest of Africa was also important, or is also important, but we were unfortunately less successful in recruiting activists. So that session mainly involved academic papers. And another major challenge was to involve ANC actors, activists, or policy makers who could contribute to a roundtable on the ANC in exile and the apartheid government's nuclear endeavors. Again, with the help of my colleagues at the politics department at UJ, we tried contacting many of these policymakers, but most of them did not even respond. And one of the speakers, for example, that we wanted to include was former President Thabo Mbeki, who played a role in the 1995 indefinite extension of the NPT. So we thought he would be a fantastic keynote speaker maybe to have at the conference. Ultimately, we had a good mix of academics and activists. So I think we pulled off a fairly good mix. So we had 5 academics that presented. 2 academics conducted the oral history interviews with the Kubek bomber and his colleague that basically planned the entire bombing. And then also my conversation with Abdul Minty. 5 activists presented. 3 activists were interviewed. And 1 government official presented. And we also then showed 1 film by an academic or an activist over the 2 days. So I think I can show. So on day 1, we kind of like started off with, you know, the focus on apartheid's atomic bombs from the perspective of the anti-apartheid struggle. So there we had Renfrew Christie, who's an academic, but he was also very much an activist working, or they called him a spy for the apartheid government called him an ANC spy. And he also spent many years in jail because of his actions against the apartheid regime. And Rodney Wilkinson is also known as the Kubek bomber. He was the actual person who placed the bombs at the Kubek nuclear power station. They did emphasize, you know, at the time that it was never, they never wanted to bomb the reactors per se. So the bombs went off in other parts of the power station, but it also halted, you know, the opening of that power station for more than a year. And then I went on with a conversation, an oral history interview, basically, with Ambassador Abdul Minty. It was just fascinating what he shared from his side in terms of how he mobilized not only civil society internationally, but also he had the privilege of speaking at the UN Security Council, at some IAEA meetings. He was involved with the Commonwealth. So there's a rich wealth of information that could be gathered from Abdul Minty in terms of anti-nuclear activism internationally against the apartheid nuclear bomb. And then we moved on day 1 to the civil society activism. And this was a really, really interesting session, because this is where we got the activists involved to talk about nuclear policy and the changing dynamics of decision-making in the policy side of things. Kubek Alert had a presentation. The Green Connection talked about the court case in 2017 against the Russian-South African nuclear deal. We had the South African Faith Communities Environment Institute presenting, and also then a paper on backwash, which was presented by an academic, but 2 academics who are actually quite involved in backwash. And then on day 2, we moved on to further, you know, activism. Unfortunately, Hebatala at the last minute was unable to join us to talk about Egypt. So we tried to focus a little bit more on Africa on the second day. So we focused also then on, you know, contemporary policies in government. So we had 1 senior official from government that participated, and she talked about South Africa's nuclear policies. And then anti-nuclear activism in Africa, yeah, we focused on the Treaty of Pelindaba, ICAN, yeah, and you can see the rest on the screen. So again, here we had a mix in the same panel by academics presenting, and at the same time also then people from civil society presenting, the activists. So the event was hybrid. We paid for most of the speakers to be present in person on site at the University of Johannesburg. And this ensured fabulous interaction between the academic and activist voices. beyond the confines of the conference room. For example, during coffee breaks, over lunchtime, it was really difficult to get everybody back in the room, because for the first time, you had academics and activists really being engaged, in conversation. So yeah, online, on day 1, we had 70 attendees, 70. And on day 2, we had 41 attendees. And I really want to give a big shout out to the activist community for fostering the excellent attendance on day 1. They really rallied their colleagues across the country and across organizations to connect digitally to the workshop. And we also then helped with data where necessary. So many of the activists also indicated that they have loads of documents to contribute to the Digital Peace Archive. So Chuck, there's some more documents coming your way, and for Luc's Digital Peace Archive. And this is something that we need to pursue in the coming months. Yeah, so and then finally, it's one thing to have a workshop, it's another thing as to where do we go with this, to foster further conversation. So I was able to secure a special edition of an in-house journal, an open access journal, The Thinker, at the University of Johannesburg. It is an online journal, and it is one of the very few, if only one, in South Africa that really allows several various types of articles. It doesn't only focus on peer-reviewed articles. So that it is currently in production. It should come out within the next 2 to 3 weeks at most. And it was co-edited by myself, Luc, and Irene. So we have 4 peer-reviewed articles in there, mostly linked to some of the sessions at the conference. But we also include here a paper on French nuclear testing. I forgot on the previous slide, I should have added that we had a paper also on the French nuclear testing in Algeria during the conference. Then we look at the role of civil society in ICAN and so on. And then very nice that we have 4 activist articles in there that looks at the African Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, or the Pelindaba Treaty. We have an activist view on anti-nuclear activism going right back to the 1980s. Nuclear policy in South Africa, and then also Packwash. And then we have the transcribed interviews with Renfrew Christie and Rodney Wilkinson about the Kuburg bombing, and then also a conversation with Abdul Minty. So yeah, Luc, Irene, and I decided that the cover of this special edition should feature this little plowshare, as you can see on the screen, which is still on display at the IAEA. It is made from the casing of one of the apartheid government's dismantled nuclear bombs, and it symbolizes basically from sword to plowshare. So it symbolizes peace, and we chose it because of the universality of the message of peace that it represents. So yes, that's it from my side. I really want to say thank you to Luc for, allowing us to, to host this conference or the workshop at the University of Johannesburg. It was a fantastic experience for us. It fostered discussion like we've never seen before in South Africa, and I'm hoping that we could actually follow up with that, to keep up the momentum of this engagement between academic society, policy making, and academics in South Africa. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anna-Mart. Lastly, we have Alicia Sanders Zakre with us, who is the Policy and Research Coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, a Nobel Peace Prize winning NGO. Previously, Alicia was a researcher at the Arms Control Association and at the Brookings Institution. She has published over 100 news articles, editorials, and reports on nuclear weapons in leading outlets around the world. Alicia, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here at this event, and it's been really a pleasure to be a partner in this project. My role at ICAN as the Policy and Research Coordinator is often trying to connect activists and academics, and particularly to do so around the world. So I really was delighted to hear about this project and glad to be a part of it. So yeah, I'll speak a bit about kind of the role of academics as activists from time to time, kind of, you know, as Luc was bringing up in the beginning, sometimes, and as Anna-Mart touched on as well, sometimes it's hard to even define activists as a distinct category from, for example, policymakers, as well as, I would say, to a certain extent, from researchers, and how, you know, the role of academics has been, and researchers has been so important in the ICAN movement and nuclear disarmament movement more broadly. I really find these new resources so useful because they're speaking to this need for this kind of collaboration between academics and activists, and how academics can contribute to the work of anti-nuclear activism. So as many of you know, and will also learn more from engaging in the online course or reading the edited volume when it comes out, scientific and academic involvement in nuclear disarmament activism is not new. And in fact, it's nearly as old as the bomb itself. Many of the original scientists who developed the first nuclear weapons during the Manhattan Project later renounced nuclear weapons and began to advocate for their total elimination. Before the bomb was even dropped on Hiroshima, scientists were concerned about possessing and using this new weapon of mass destruction. And there were 70 scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project who signed a petition drafted by Leo Szilard in July 1945 to express their concern about the moral responsibilities of possessing nuclear weapons. In 1946, it was Szilard who worked with Albert Einstein to create the Emergency Committee of the Atomic Scientists to warn the public about the danger of nuclear weapons. In an initial fundraising letter for the committee in 1946, Einstein wrote that we scientists recognize our inescapable responsibility to carry to our fellow citizens an understanding of the simple facts of atomic energy and its implications for society. In this lies our only security and our only hope. We believe that an informed citizenry will act for life and not for death. Other scientists took up the call and formed organizations that still exist today, some of which are part of ICAN today, to raise awareness about the dangers of nuclear weapons. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, for example, was first founded in 1945 by Manhattan Project scientists who could not remain aloof to the consequences of their work, as they said. And it continues to exist today as a platform for scientists, policymakers, and activists to speak out against nuclear weapons risks and consequences. Einstein and others formed Pugwash in 1955 to draw attention to the dangers of thermonuclear weapons and the need to peacefully resolve conflicts. The Union of Concerned Scientists, one of ICAN's partners as well, was formed in 1968 to express the opposition to projects such as the ABM system, the enlargement of nuclear arsenal, and the development of chemical and biological weapons. And so in addition to forming these organizations, scientists, including physicians and climate scientists, have played a really key role in helping anti-nuclear activism by documenting the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons. And I think Luc alluded to this in speaking to kind of ICAN's development from rigorous research, which we were lucky to have due to the work of academics and scientists. As a few examples, Soviet physicist Andrei Sakharov, who worked on Soviet thermonuclear weapons, began publishing articles in the 1950s on the hazards of radioactive fallout. Dr. Helen Caldicott is very well known for using her scientific expertise and concern about the medical effects of radioactive fallout to form positions for social responsibility and mobilize a mass movement to freeze the nuclear arms race in the 1980s. Also in the 1980s, of course, astrophysicist Carl Sagan began to warn the public about nuclear winter and the terrifying long-term consequences of nuclear war that could lead to global famine and starvation. And we're still seeing updated studies on nuclear winter coming out today, indicating that the consequences could be even more devastating than previously expected. And we're glad that some of these scientists are active within ICAN and present this information to activists so that we can use that to convince the public about the really the danger posed by nuclear weapons today. So as I've mentioned, this history continues very much today. Scientists and researchers are, I would say, well a part of ICAN, although we always welcome many more. As a few examples, back in July 2017, there were over 3,700 scientists from around the world that signed a letter in support of negotiating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and calling on their governments to support the treaty. Today, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which, as Luc mentioned, you can learn much more about in the online course, has 94 signatory countries and 73 states parties. This is really a landmark treaty that prohibits states parties from developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, using, threatening to use nuclear weapons. It also prohibits them from assisting anyone to engage in any of these prohibited activities. And furthermore, it provides these positive obligations for states to provide victim assistance and environmental remediation for people in places harmed by nuclear weapons use and testing. So academics and researchers have played a really important role throughout the negotiation of the TPNW, and they're still doing that as the treaty is now entered into force and is being implemented. As a few examples, there have been a number of academic articles published on the verification structure in the treaty, as well as about victim assistance and environmental remediation, the needs of people who live in countries that were affected by nuclear weapons use and testing. The treaty also created a scientific advisory group to advise states on technical aspects of implementation and really build up a network of scientists for disarmament. And this is a group of 15 scientists from around the world. States that have joined the treaty nominated scientists to be a part of this scientific panel. There's a lot of, I think, other really useful research, even if it's not specifically on the TPNW, that strengthens ICAN's work and our campaigning. For example, academic research on norms and disarmament have really revealed important advancements in the nuclear disarmament landscape, and how the TPNW works to influence international law and international norms to push forward disarmament. Likewise, there's academics and researchers that do polling research that underscores the gap between some countries' public policies to not join the treaty and democratic support to join the treaty and to support disarmament. And we use this kind of research really in campaigners around the world use it, and then we've cited such research in ICAN publications, like a report we published a couple of years ago on NATO, documenting why many countries within NATO would support joining the treaty. I would say another reason why we find working with academics so useful, and academic research about nuclear disarmament so important, is because we know that the cards are stacked against us. We know that nuclear armed and nuclear allied defense departments around the world fund researchers to do research on nuclear weapons that is critical of disarmament, that is critical of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We put out an annual research report on global nuclear weapons spending, and we've shown that most major think tanks that research and write about nuclear weapons in nuclear armed countries actually receive funding from the companies that make nuclear weapons. And that's in the realm of between $5 to $10 million annually. Another ICAN report from 2019 showed that nearly 50 colleges and universities in the United States are tied to the nuclear weapons production complex. from universities like the University of California that directly manages a nuclear weapons laboratory, to professors that receive contracts to do research that is relevant for nuclear weapons work, to workforce pipeline programs to try to usher in the next generation of nuclear weapons scientists. So all this is to say that work for nuclear disarmament academics and researchers is really incredibly important and valuable for activists who are trying to pursue nuclear disarmament. Even as it may be difficult and underfunded, there really is such an incredible precedent of how scientists and academics can really change the nuclear disarmament landscape. And I think this new online course and edited volume on anti-nuclear activism is such an incredible contribution to this work. And I hope that it really encourages more researchers, more academics to reach out and get connected to activists and vice versa. And I look forward to circulating these materials widely within the ICAN campaign and trying to make that happen.
Great, thank you, Alicia. If all of our speakers are finished, we can now move on to questions and answers with our live audience. As a reminder, if you're watching the webcast, you can submit a question using the online form that appears immediately below the video screen on the website. We do have a couple of questions already, but I also do want to encourage our panelists to ask any questions of each other or to make comments on one another's presentations. Two of the questions that have come in, actually, I'll start with a very simple one. Someone asked for the link for the free course that Luc was talking about. I've already added that to the website. So if you are interested in looking at that course, if you scroll down under the panel overview, you should see a link under related resources. One of the questions is a bit bigger and maybe more challenging to answer, and I think it's primarily for Alicia. So I'll ask it, but then I'm going to ask a more simple one for Luc, and you can sort of ponder over the more difficult question. And I'm sort of combining a few different threads that came in. But it's basically, well, it's two questions. Sort of what is giving you optimism in the movement to reduce or eliminate nuclear weapons, as well as what is making you pessimistic in your work at this moment in time. And so that's a big question, may take a moment to think about. So an easier one for Luc, and this comes from a PhD candidate in the United Kingdom, who says they are currently conducting oral history interviews with anti-nuclear activists, and they would like to know if you could elaborate on the requirements for contributing materials to the Digital Peace Archive. I think that one's easier, so we'll start with Luc.
There we are. Great. So thanks very much for your interest and for your question. I'd love to hear more about the research that you're doing. So in terms of submitting material for the Digital Peace Archive, if you just want to send me an email and kind of give me a sense of what you have, then we can take it from there. In short, if you simply have photographs of any documents, materials of any kind, then the idea is that we would take these and then upload them with Chuck's cooperation for the digital archive. And then along with each document, we would also provide a short description explaining basically what the document is, why is it interesting, what does it tell us, as well as the origin, kind of who made it, in what year, that kind of thing. And I should also say that we absolutely welcome documents and submissions in really in any language. So if you're working with documents that are not in English, that's absolutely fine. That's encouraged. And then we can look into having those translated as well, so that researchers can access a wide range of items. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but please do drop me an email. I'd love to hear more.
Great. Thanks, Luke. Alicia, do you want to circle back to the other set of questions?
Sure, yeah. I think what gives me hope and what I'm optimistic about really is working on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and being a part of a global campaign. I'm originally from the US. It's very challenging to work in a nuclear armed state. And often, as you know, as I think this project has spoken to, too often the narratives and research around nuclear weapons policies and activism are so dominated by those in nuclear armed states. But what's really empowering is being a part of a global campaign and realizing and knowing that the global majority supports nuclear disarmament, that most countries in the world have chosen not to get nuclear weapons because they recognize that these are weapons that are unacceptable, that would cause mass civilian harm, catastrophic humanitarian and environmental damage beyond our comprehension, and that they are simply too risky to consider possessing because there's always the chance of accidental or intentional nuclear use as long as nuclear weapons exist. And so the fact that there is a growing number of countries that are joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that are meeting actively, constructively, agreeing to progress, to take forward this treaty and to universalize it, to get all countries to sign on and further the norm against nuclear weapons, take a verified pathway towards nuclear disarmament, does give me a lot of hope. It was actually just earlier this week that there were 3 more countries that joined the TPNW, including Indonesia, which is a massive country, really an incredible addition to the global support for the TPNW that exists already. So I think that's really promising, and it's hard work, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but we're really slowly chipping away at the legitimacy that the minority of countries in the world continue to ascribe to nuclear weapons. I think what's challenging maybe on the flip side is that I would say, you know, really significant progress and breakthroughs on nuclear disarmament don't happen every day. It was really an incredible moment to be incredible moment when the treaty was adopted, for example, at the United Nations. You know, we know that really incredible change can happen very quickly and very suddenly when kind of all of the political conditions align, but it means that it doesn't happen every day. So I think that sometimes it's anti-nuclear activism is really building up the conditions and constantly pushing and working for one of these breakthrough moments. But sometimes it is challenging that it's, you know, you're often pushing up against a wall and not always seeing the results of your work. So I think that's yeah, that can be challenging as we see that nuclear risks are ongoing and are rising, and that every day that nuclear weapons exist, there is the threat of their use. So we have to just keep pushing and try to get to those breakthrough moments.
If I could ask a question of both Anna-Mart and Luc, and it's basically if the two of you as historians, if you could talk a little bit more about your methodology of studying anti-nuclear activism. As someone who's, you know, my own research tends to focus on the decisions of policymakers and states, there's a clear, there's a logic to where you find that type of information. You go to an archive, it's going to be preserved and arranged in a way that's easy to understand and anticipate, even if the materials are not always immediately accessible or accessible in a reasonable time frame. But when you're studying, you know, these disparate groups of civil society organizations and individuals, who may not have had an archive or may not have deposited their papers somewhere, or there's no logic to how they were deposited or how they're organized. That raises a lot of challenges, I imagine. So I wonder if the two of you could just sort of talk us through your methodology of researching and writing about, you know, these global histories of anti-nuclear activism.
Yes, Chuck, that's a very relevant question, because as I alluded to also in my talk, when Luc asked me to you know, if we could have a workshop like this in South Africa, my immediate thought was, oh my goodness, where am I going to find the people, the documents, the et cetera, because as you say, on a policy level and on a diplomacy level and that sort of thing, you go to an archive and you find all these, you know, folders there, and you ask for declassification, and there's cross references between folders, but it becomes more difficult when you have to deal with activists. I think in hindsight, what I was really surprised about, and it came out during the conference or during the workshop, was how many of these activists actually have their own archives, their own personal archives. Because there isn't really a place where they can deposit these papers, you know, on a government level or in a government archive. But many of them have been involved with this for so many years. I take, for example, Mike Canty of Kuberg, who was one of the speakers at the workshop, and who's been involved with Kuberg since the early 1980s. Also in the room was Peter Becker, who took over from Mike Canty. And there was this kind of like a handover, not only of information that were built up since the early 1980s, but also in a way, you know, a transfer of documents from what I could gather between the two of them. So it's a legacy that gets carried over to the next generation of activists. That's the one thing that really stood out for me. The second thing was, of course, as I said, the personal archives. And Mike Canty went as far as to actually publish a book on all of the documents that he had gathered, you know, since the early 1980s on anti-nuclear activism within the, you know, auspices of Kuberg. The challenge is, where do we go with those papers? And that is why I'm very excited about, you know, Luc's Peace Archive, and also the fact that it's going to be linked to the Wilson Center, who already has such a good track record in terms of, you know, the archive that you guys have built up. So finally, I think we will have a place where we can deposit that papers. But that was the case in South Africa. I don't know the case in other countries necessarily, but for me, that was almost like that baton is being handed over to the next generation together with a set of documents, you know. And these people aren't just activists for a few years. It's a work of a lifetime for them. You can see it's a life's work. And they often get involved in various organizations, and not only one organization in South Africa. So they also have documents that relate, you know, to various other organizations. So yeah, so I think that for me was a real eye-opener in terms of that it's not that difficult to find the documents if you just know who to ask. In the case of Abdul Menti, because he was, you know, such a regarded person in the international community in terms of anti-apartheid, you know, it was easy enough to find his papers at the anti-apartheid collection at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So his is well documented, those documents. But yeah, in South Africa, it boils down to the personal collections of activists.
I guess I'll pick up on a couple of the points that you raised, Anna-Mart. Certainly, I think personal archives, it's a huge treasure trove of information for researchers. But again, the challenge is finding them, right? Finding the activists and the documents they may have at their disposal. Certainly, one thing that I've done in my own work is to complement kind of archival research with oral history. And so, if there are activists, particularly, I'm working on a reasonably recent period in the 1980s, so a lot of those who were active in campaigns in the 1980s are still available to interview. And I think in every interview I've done, I will ask, do you have any documents that you'd be able to share? And in some cases, they've already deposited them with a university library somewhere, and I can track them down there. In some cases, they'll say, oh yeah, it's kind of in my loft, in my attic. I have X number of boxes of relevant documents. and in some cases, they've then been able to scan relevant documents and share them with me that way. So it's a very haphazard methodology in that way. You're at the mercy of what you happen to come across. But I think it certainly is an avenue worth exploring. Otherwise, I mean, there are some very well-established collections or libraries that do have really remarkable collections on anti-nuclear activism. So in the UK, I think LSE Library is really a standout resource for kind of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, related to the Green and Common Women's Peace Camp, European Nuclear Disarmament, END, and many others. I think is all available there for researchers. In the US, I think the Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania is really a remarkable collection or series of collections there. I mean, as I'm currently finishing up a book on anti-nuclear activism in Canada, and they're actually just the National Archives, Library Archives Canada, has the collections of individual organizations like Greenpeace Canada, Voice of Women, Operation Dismantle. There was a Parliament Hill Peace Camp, and they've donated their records there. So it does make it a kind of a one-stop shop where, in addition to the government records, you can also see all the non-state records as well, which has yielded a huge amount of information. And then the last point I'd make is that we can actually tell an awful lot about activism by looking at government records. So I think looking at, for example, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library or the National Archives in the UK, we can see how, I mean, the issue of these surging peace movements in the 1980s, these were discussed at the very top levels of governments, and their arguments were discussed. They figured out strategies for countering the highly successful campaigns. So even by looking at the kind of the more traditional route of kind of state archives, we can learn a lot, especially about these dynamics between policymakers and international diplomacy and activism. So I think taking all that together, we can piece together quite I hope a fairly comprehensive history of anti-nuclear activism.
Great. We've got a question from someone affiliated with the Episcopal Church and its Office of Government Relations. And they ask, what is the, and I'm going to add a little bit to their question because I think it's, they're interested in more current day things, but I think there could be a historical dimension to the question. And it's about the role of faith-based organizations in disarmament. And maybe that's something Luc could speak to from a historical perspective, the role of faith-based organizations and anti-nuclear activism, but also Alicia, maybe you could speak to that from the perspective of ICAN today.
Shall I go first? Yes, I mean, I think from an historical perspective, I mean, faith organizations have played a massive role in anti-nuclear activism, really from the very beginning. I think groups like the Quakers have been especially active. In the 1980s, we have sort of anti-nuclear statements coming from notably the Catholic Church, the US bishops. I mean, the current Pope has voiced his views on opposing nuclear weapons. The World Council of Churches and other organizations have been incredibly active. So I think they've, and in many cases, they've provided leadership. So the big anti-nuclear organization in the UK in the 1980s, CND, was led by Monsignor Bruce Kent as well. So I think in many ways, they are incredibly important actors historically and indeed to this very day. And as Anna-Mart noted, I mean, this was one of the first organizations that she reached out to in South Africa in bringing together anti-nuclear activists on the issue. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, and I'll hand over to Alicia to provide the more current situation.
Yeah, I can say certainly on a global level, we really see how important faith-based organizations and communities are as a key part of ICAN. One of the really leading organizations that's a part of ICAN's international governance or international steering group is the African Council for Religious Leaders, for example, Religions for Peace. And as well, I would say that, yeah, it was really significant when Pope Francis really changed the Catholic Church stance on nuclear weapons to being completely against nuclear weapons and for the prohibition of nuclear weapons in terms of the engagement and advocacy in in very Catholic countries. And the outreach that civil society were able to do with government leaders that had a really, really significant impact. So I would say that absolutely, the faith-based communities are very important part of the nuclear disarmament movement, both in terms of being able to engage with a broader population to meet and reach out to other people, as well as demonstrating, I think, the morality of nuclear disarmament and of the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and the kind of validation that religious leaders can lend to that call.
Great, thank you. As we are getting close to the end of our designated time, I did want to give the three of you the opportunity, if you had any questions for each other or comments on one another's presentations, please do feel free to speak up.
I suppose one question that I had, not to put you on the spot, Alicia, but I think in my sort of remarks I'd mentioned that I had some kind of lingering fears about kind of academics and activists working together. There may be some friction on either, right? An academic may come up with something that activists may not want to hear, or equally an academic may feel kind of pressured to have their conclusions conform with a certain issue or campaign, and so on. I was wondering, in your experience, and I'm not asking for indiscretions or for you to name names or anything, but have either of these kind of materialized in your experience, or more broadly? I mean, what's it like from your position as an activist in terms of cooperating with academics?
Yeah, I was really glad to hear you bring that up and kind of assure us that your initial concerns, perhaps, of being particularly kind of pressured by activists to take on a certain stance or to jeopardize your academic objectivity, essentially, would be, that was essentially not proven true by the work with activists. It was very encouraging to hear, because I think that is something that we hear often from academics, that they're concerned about being too closely associated perhaps with an activist movement, and that's true for some, certainly not for all. As I said, there really is this long history of academics really being a part of activist movements, and even for scientists, as I was speaking about, really seeing it as actually part of their duty in kind of their multifaceted being, not just as academics, but also citizens of countries, to take a stance and to be a part of advocating for certain policies or not. I think that that we see that actually it's not a challenge necessarily to academic integrity to work with an activist movement, or to have your research be supportive of a particular movement. Of course, that wouldn't be the intention, but we see that just objective research about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons doesn't have to conclude with any activist manifesto, but just the pure facts of what nuclear weapons do and what they are very powerful and very useful for those who are advocating for their abolition. I would say that's a really important role that academics can play in terms of supporting activists, without feeling that they are pressured in any way to have some form of conclusion that that is particularly meant to support activists. So I think there are many ways to be supportive of a goal of abolishing nuclear weapons, without jeopardizing any form of academic integrity. And I think another point that I would make to that as well is that I think you see more of a concern about being associated with an activist cause than necessarily with kind of a status quo cause. And so, for example, there's not a lot of challenge to government-funded research, for example, or other entity-funded research in the way that maybe people would react to research that's funded by an activist movement, even though we both have policies that we're endorsing and we're advocating for and we're pursuing. And it's just kind of the perception, again, of who's an activist and who has an agenda and who doesn't, that can really come in the way there. So yeah, I think, I think there definitely is really an important role for researchers and academics to work alongside and even within activist movements.
If I may add something there, it's very good that you say this, Alicia, because in my experience, I know quite a number of my colleagues in South Africa are both academics and activists, in different spheres of society. When it specifically comes back to nuclear, it was very interesting to see at the workshop. There were quite a handful of academics participating in the workshop who are also very much were involved in, ICAN or, play leadership roles in PACWASH and so on. So for them, it was never around, are there clashing objectives, and coming back to the integrity of what we are doing. I think within the academic community, we can raise a lot of awareness among students, in particular, by kind of like having a dual role that don't clash. Renfrew Christie, later when he was released from jail, he became an academic, and he continued with his activism, well past the liberation struggle. Yeah, so I do think that academics should not shy away from taking on activist roles. It shouldn't clash with, the part and parcel of what we teach and the awareness that we raise in what we do.
Great. Unless there are any other final questions or comments for each other, I think we can bring this panel to a conclusion. I would like to thank the three of you for taking the time to join us and share your research and your perspectives on this issue. For all of our live viewers, thank you also for joining us. I encourage all of you to stay engaged with the work of the Wilson Center and specifically with the History and Public Policy program. Subscribe to our weekly events, check out our digital archive at digitalarchive.org, and follow us on social media to stay engaged with all of our publications and other things that we're doing. So thank you again to Luc, Anna-Mart, and Alicia for joining us today.